Ahoy, ahoy. It's such an honor to be in the center of naval history with all of you today. So I'm an Army veteran, and this weekend, Army is going to beat the hell out of Navy, so I'm just so excited about that. So,
He's the captain now.
Yeah, I'm the captain now. So, Army veteran, transitioned into full-stack web development, and in my ample free time, I'm also the chapter lead for Operation Code, a nonprofit dedicated to helping transitioning military spouses, and veterans learn to code, break into tech, and give back through open source software. And I really want to thank all the organizers today. I really appreciate the chance to bring a +1. As my +1, I brought Juan. Juan is an Army veteran. And you just finished General Assembly, is that right? So he just finished the General Assembly Web Development Immersive Program, and he is looking for a junior developer job working in React. So I'm hoping that some of you can talk with him in the hallway track at some point. Yeah, he's a beast. He's great. So anyway, to the talk. So if you're maybe a Gen Xer or an elder millennial like me, maybe you might recognize the reference to Fight the Power, the 1989 hip-hop hit. But I'm not going to talk about classic hip-hop. I'm going to talk about building decentralized web apps with React and Solid. So 1989 is kind of a seminal year in a couple of ways. Obviously, Fight the Power was one thing. Also, Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. And the reason I'm kind of giving this talk is a couple of months ago, there was quite a bit of press around Tim Berners-Lee coming out saying some really, really strong things about the state of the World Wide Web. I want to read just a couple of things from his Medium post. So this is from September 29th. I've always believed the web is for everyone. That's why I and others fight fiercely to protect it. The changes we've managed to bring have created a better and more connected world. But for all the good we've achieved, the web has evolved into an engine of iniquity and division, swayed by powerful forces who use it for their own agendas. Today, I believe we've reached a critical tipping point, and that powerful change for the better is possible and necessary. That's why I have, over recent years, been working with a few people at MIT and elsewhere to develop Solid, an open source project to restore the power and agency of individuals on the web. So when I read all this news coverage, I'd never heard of Solid before. And my talk here today is basically as a full stack React developer, investigating Solid, understanding kind of the computer science principles behind it, and how one can go ahead and build an app using the linked data principles that Solid uses. So if I were to kind of describe what Solid is trying to provide us, it's basically it's trying to provide an alternative to our centralized social networks. So right now, with GDPR, there's a big push that users own their own data. And so since we own our own data, we should be able to bail out of a social network and pull down all that social networking data. The problem is, I don't know if you've ever used these kinds of tools before, you end up getting like a zip or a tarball, and you have a lot of metadata structured in a way that you can't really do anything with. It's all based around their architecture. And so, I mean, it's kind of a false alternative. Like the only thing you can really do is go full on Amish if that's your thing. So here's a picture of Tim Berners-Lee based on his receding hairline. I'd say that's about 1994 or so. And on the blackboard behind him, he has a lot of different kind of principles of things he's been working on, but I want you to just kind of focus in on that circle there that says Semantic Web. So Semantic Web is probably like the most important World Wide Web concept that you've never heard of. Like, can I get a show of hands who's heard of Semantic Web? Okay. Actually, good, more than I expected. Okay, so Semantic Web has basically been an area of computer science research. Like, I think out of everything in the World Wide Web, it's probably most overrepresented by computer science PhDs. Pretty much all the software seems to be written for someone's like master's thesis or PhD dissertation. So kind of questionable code sometimes, but anyway. So the core idea of the Semantic Web is basically this concept of linked data. And I want to take a couple of minutes to kind of go through this because it's a really powerful concept. Basically, the idea is how can we use the core primitives of HTML, or excuse me, HTTP, and use it for something other than HTML? So how can we use HTTP for semantic content that is machine readable? And these are basically the 4 commandments for that. So to kind of go through the first 2, forget everything you know about URLs. URLs are not just for web pages. URLs are for everything. I am a URL. Each of you are your own individual URLs. Your URL is your canonical identity on the World Wide Web. And so URLs can represent people, can represent like paintings. I should have put our previous speaker's face over this one probably. Oh well. And so once you have a universal identity on the World Wide Web, you end up being able to do some pretty powerful things with it. And so I'm just going to kind of go through an example. So very similar to using a URL to fetch HTML web pages, instead we are fetching structured data, which is structured as linked data. And linked data is kind of like an English sentence. We have a subject, we have a predicate, and we have an object. So you can kind of think of the predicate as kind of like a verb. So if we were to fetch Bob's canonical URL, we get that he's the subject. He's a person. That's kind of like object orientation in a certain way. He has a name, Bob. He's interested in this, whatever the heck this thing is, represented by this URL. And he is a friend of whoever this person is, represented by this URL. And so you can kind of see that these predicates have a lot of semantic meaning. And these are actually formalized in particular vocabularies that we import and use in particular ways. And the objects, they can be either primitives or they can be URLs, which then point to other things. So to be able to use this, it's sort of, you can kind of compare this to GraphQL in certain ways, but instead of a resolver, you're using HTTP to then go out and fetch data from these other URLs. So if we want to find out about Bob, we can find out he's interested in Mona Lisa. Then we have to do a second HTTP request to this URL for Mona Lisa to find out details about this. And then if we wanted to find out about the creator of the Mona Lisa, we'd have to go to this URL. And we can just keep going as deep as we want, like infinitely deep. So one thing you might kind of be thinking to yourself here is, boy, this seems like a lot of HTTP requests. And you would definitely be right. And we'll see that later with the example app. So once we take all of this linked data and aggregate it together, we end up with a graph data structure. And that graph data structure is something we can use as the backend for our applications. So I was showing kind of an abstract syntax to simplify linked data. Here's a more realistic syntax that you might actually see over the wire. This is basically my profile expressed in Turtle. Turtle is just kind of like, I guess, the new hot semantic web schema. Yeah. So I mentioned vocabularies, and one of the most popular vocabularies is this friend of a friend vocabulary. And it's actually really old. I think it was created in like 94. And so if you look at like what constitutes a person, you've got, you know, Myers-Briggs, ooh, and then you've got things like AIM chat ID. And I don't even know what a geek code is. Does anyone know what a geek code is? Okay, I've got a couple folks. Talk to me later, I'm curious. Okay, so you've probably actually been using the semantic web without realizing it. So when you use Google or a modern search engine, you get kind of the traditional web crawler document stuff here on the left. And this thing here on the right, this is the Google Knowledge Graph. And Google has particular crawlers that go out to scrape semantic web content. So this is probably pulled from essentially Wikipedia, which has been refactored into semantic web content in a structure similar to what I showed earlier. So these would all be triples about Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and we can kind of click through and see all the details about him and everything. So like before, we didn't necessarily have an alternative, but now with this idea of linked data, we can actually export our metadata, restructure it as linked data, and pull that into Solid. So with Solid, everyone has their own Solid pod. And this is something you could be purchasing through a commercial Solid pod hosting provider, or it could be something that you self-host on a Raspberry Pi or whatever. This is all open source software based around W3C standards. And you can kind of think of it as like a super Google Drive. So you have kind of normal file storage. You also have structured data storage for linked data. And you have things like this My Inbox, which basically allows you to have social media feeds come in and aggregated in a particular place. You can access this using just normal HTTP verbs and also WebSockets. And by having those kinds of open interfaces, then when you sign up for social media apps, instead of like signing up for like a Facebook and then filling out all of their forms and powering their schema for your metadata, instead you basically grant the social media app access to the stuff you've already filled out using W3C standards. And so that means that they have basically temporary read and potentially write access to pieces of your data. And that's a pretty powerful concept because maybe you have multiple social networks. And then, for example, if you were to change your name, you could go in and change it once, and that would basically take effect across all the social networks. You might notice here on the bottom, we've got this URL. I mentioned earlier that every person is basically a URL, and this is my solid URL. So this contains everything about me on the World Wide Web. And if we want to connect with people, because really social networks they're all about human connections, we express that using vocabularies like that friend of a friend vocabulary. So here's my solid pod connecting with my wife's solid pod, and I tried to get her to go through the sign up process, and she totally wouldn't do it, so I had to just kind of do it when she wasn't looking. So yeah, so we end up with this kind of complicated architecture, but thankfully a computer science PhD realizes that they need to kind of meet us halfway as full stack web developers. So there is this solid React Components NPM module you can pull in, and it really simplifies building a web app with solid. The core thing it provides is this LD flex syntax language, which is actually pretty powerful. You basically can access arbitrary data on the graph as if it were JSON. And behind the scenes, the client-side library acts kind of like a GraphQL resolver and figures out how many HTTP requests it has to make across the network to get all that data. So you don't really have to worry about it as the individual application developer. So here, like user is a special term for the currently logged in user, and this is basically, I pass this in as an LD flex statement, and I get back my first name, Sean. That would be one HTTP request. The second one here is kind of special. This is basically saying I want to get the first name of all of my friends. And so to do that, we need to first go to my solid pod to get a list of the URLs of all my friends. And then we have to do an HTTP request to each of those endpoints to fetch that first name. So if I have 100 friends, it's 101 HTTP requests right there. This solid React Components library provides authentication, so it's really easy to get started with that. And the one thing I really need to call out here is it's very much a work in progress. They're working on it all the time, and the main limitation is that it's read-only. I was hoping to have like a more full-featured social network, and it's just not possible to build that right now. So what does it kind of look like here? I mean, this is probably a little small and tough to see, but you import certain special components like this list component. You pass in this LD flex statement here, and you can kind of see here I'm templating a URL for a particular user, which is stored in React Router in this case. And then I'm using that to basically render a grid of friends, including their image and their name. And so then if you kind of think about it, if n is the number of friends, and we're doing 2 queries, one for an image and one for a name per friend, that's 2n plus 1 HTTP requests. So it can be pretty hefty there. I styled the app with styled components, and it worked pretty well. So on the whole, pretty good code for a computer science PhD. So if you want to kind of check out my code to see how it works, it's available on GitHub and currently deployed on Netlify. Please make sure you use Firefox, because Chrome has some security protections which kind of break the solid architecture right now. I think they're kind of figuring it out and hopefully resolved pretty soon. Okay, so over here, basically you can see the sample app. It's like obviously kind of cribbed off Facebook. I can click up here to view my profile. And we can see some biographic data. I just had my birthday recently, actually. And, oh, same birthday?
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah. And I'm using your laptop, too.
Yeah. We're getting way close.
Yeah. So click through. You can see my friends here. And if I kind of scroll down here, you can see request to katemoreno.solid.community and emrieger.solid.community. So request to the separate endpoints for each of those folks. And I can click through to Kate's profile and all that. And so, I mean, this seems to work okay, but I want to kind of show you what happens with the nature of this really distributed architecture, because, I mean, it definitely affects how things scale with a lot of nodes on a graph. So this guy, Ruben Verbog, he's like one of the main developers. He developed this React library I'm using. And he has he's friends with basically everyone that works in the Semantic Web community. And if we click on his friends list, I guess I want someone to guess, how many requests do you think we're going to see? Someone throw out a number. Any idea?
600.
600,000? Okay, let's see. Okay, so we're up to 100. We're starting to get some names. We see Tim Berners-Lee in his picture. Up to 492. So, yeah, so quite a bit there. So, I mean, I think to me, the biggest surprise here, I mean, I guess it shouldn't be a surprise, but the thing that I didn't really realize is when Facebook provides a social network, you're getting all the data from one place. And when everyone has their own solid pod, even though it's an improvement for privacy, it adds some real world architectural issues for being able to build a usable app. And so I kind of think that there might be some research that needs to be done around things like content delivery networks for linked data, for example, and some sort of trust model around that. And so, I think it's a solvable problem, but currently there's some things that aren't, users are going to be kind of disappointed with the performance here. Okay, so I mentioned kind of the performance issues here, O of n for the number of friends, or there are a lot of things where it's 2n plus 1. But I kind of think, I had a lot of fun building this, and I haven't really messed around with blockchain or things like that, but a big turnoff for me is the idea of having to build in a whole different language. This is really based on the web, and it uses HTTP and HTML and all that kinds of stuff. And so I think if you're interested in looking at some of these new types of architectures that really respect user privacy, definitely check it out. And Solid could use your help. They've really doubled down on the JavaScript ecosystem. All of their server-side components are written in Node.js. They have client-side libraries for the major frameworks, which are very much a work in progress and getting worked on all the time. And since they have so many computer science PhDs, they need more real-world full-stack developers that are able to kind of make sure that the developer experience really just doesn't suck for this stuff. So I threw up a couple of project ideas that maybe, if you feel inspired, you could take a run with. I was hoping to have this going, but wasn't able to get it done for this event. A temporary social network where maybe you have a clock at the top and the whole social network explodes or whatever, and so it's kind of you got a temporary type thing here. E-voting app that hides individual voting records and other things like that. And I just want to close with this last quote here. So the web, as I envisioned it, we have not yet seen. The future is still so much bigger than the past. Thank you very much.